Basically, we're looking at the heavyweight showdown of Keynesian economics versus this radical thinker named Milton Friedman.
And we should probably state right up front, I mean, economics is highly political.
Right, of course.
The debate between Keynesian government intervention and Friedman's free market approach is one of the great ideological battles of the last century. So we aren't here to pick sides or declare a winner or endorse one political view over the other.
Yeah, we are simply going to break down how the source materials we're exploring today diagnose the actual mechanics of inflation. We want to understand the argument. Is inflation fundamentally a market failure, or is it a government mistake?
Exactly. And perhaps most urgently for you listening right now, we really need to figure out if our modern society is currently repeating a 50-year-old blunder.
Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand the battle, we have to set the stage in the 1970s, because they weren't just experiencing a little bit of inflation back then. It was like pure economic chaos.
It really was. We are talking about a phenomenon called stagflation. And stagflation is a very specific, very toxic economic cocktail.
Yeah.
It's characterized by high inflation, high unemployment, and low economic growth, all happening at the exact same time.
Which, according to the dominant economic theory of that era, Keynesian economics was supposed to be completely impossible, right?
Right.
Because the historical trade-off was supposed to be like a seesaw. If you had high inflation, you at least get low unemployment. And if unemployment went up, well, inflation was supposed to cool down.
That was the accepted wisdom, yeah. Post-World War II, the Keynesian playbook relied heavily on the idea that governments could essentially micromanage the economy to keep that seesaw balanced.
Just tweak the dials a bit.
Exactly. If the economy slowed down and people lost jobs, the government should just spend more money. And central banks should print more money to stimulate demand.
The idea being that this extra cash would encourage businesses to hire more workers and produce more goods.
Right. But in the 1970s, that seesaw completely broke. The standard playbook completely failed to provide any answers to this new crisis.
Because governments kept spending and central banks kept printing, but instead of fixing the unemployment problem, inflation just spiraled wildly out of control.
Yeah, the old models were just shattering. Policymakers were pumping money into the system, but, that only works if the money actually translates into new production and new jobs.
Right.
In the 70s, the economic system was essentially clogged. Pouring more money into a stagnant system didn't create more goods. It just meant you had way more dollars chasing the exact same number of goods.
Let me try to put this into a relatable analogy for you. Imagine you are driving a car and you get stuck in some really deep, thick mud. The Keynesian approach at the time was basically to just slam your foot on the gas pedal. Now, because you're in the mud, you aren't actually moving forward. So that represents the low growth and high unemployment.
Makes sense.
But because you have your foot pinned to the floor, your engine is redlining and completely overheating. That overheating engine is the runaway inflation. You are burning up the engine, but you are still stuck.
That is a really highly accurate way to look at it, actually. The underlying rules of the economy had shifted, but the policymakers hadn't realized it yet. They just kept hitting the gas.
Yeah.
And when the old rules no longer apply and the dominant theory fails so spectacularly, it creates this giant intellectual vacuum.
And into that vacuum stepped Milton Friedman with a completely paradigm-shifting idea. The core of his argument, and this is a famous quote that our materials highlight, is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
It is a definitive, very sweeping statement. And to understand the mechanics behind it, we really have to look at Friedman's simple but incredibly powerful equation.
Okay, let's hear it.
He argued that the entire process flows in one rigid direction. Money supply dictates demand, which in turn dictates prices.
So break that down for us a little bit. How does that equation actually work in the real world?
Well, he explained it as a mathematical certainty. If a government prints too much money, they are mathematically destroying the purchasing power of their currency.
Right.
Imagine an economy that only has 10 apples and $10. Each apple costs $1. If the government suddenly prints another $10 and hands it out, but there's still only 10 apples, the price of an apple is going to go up to $2.
The value of the money itself has just been diluted.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to push back here because I think a lot of people listening are going to feel the exact same way I do. When I see the price of a dozen eggs double, and then I see that same supermarket chain posting record corporate profit.
Right. The profit.
Yeah, my immediate instinct is to blame corporate greed. You think, these are just greedy businesses taking advantage of us. So are you telling me these corporations are entirely off the hook? How does policy alone drive this?
This raises a really important question,
Mhm.
and it's a huge sticking point for a lot of people trying to understand macroeconomics. Friedman's argument wasn't that corporations aren't greedy.
Okay.
I mean, human nature and a corporation's desire for profit are constants. They're always trying to maximize their profits. But if greed is a constant, like if they were greedy 10 years ago and they're greedy today, it can't logically explain a sudden, massive spike in prices across the entire economy.
Wait, so what changes if not the greed?
What changes the environment?
Huh.
And the environment is dictated by the money supply.
Ah.
If the central bank prints a massive amount of new money and the government hands it out, suddenly consumers have a lot more cash in their pockets. They rush out to buy things.
Right, because they finally have the money to do it.
Exactly. And the corporations look around and see a massive artificial spike in demand for their limited supply of goods. So what do? They raise prices.
Yeah, of course they do.
They aren't raising prices because they suddenly became more evil overnight. They are raising prices because the excess money supply in the system is acting as a catalyst, practically forcing the prices upward. The policy created the excess money, which created the artificial demand, which gave corporations the room to charge more.
Wow. Okay, so what does this all mean for actually fixing the problem? Because having a theoretical diagnosis is one thing, but implementing the cure is something else entirely.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult.
Getting politicians to swallow a bitter economic pill, to literally tell their voters, we are going to stop printing money and handing it out, is notoriously difficult. But by the late 70s, things had gotten so bad that we finally saw dramatic policy shifts.
Yes, the pain of inflation finally outweighed the political fear of acting. In the United States, you had pivotal figures like Paul Volcker taking over the Federal Reserve and President Ronald Reagan in the White House, who actually started applying Friedman's framework.
And they did not mess around. They went straight for the root of the problem. They aggressively restricted the money supply, and Volcker jacked up interest rates to incredibly high levels.
They did.
But let's pause here. Explain the mechanism for us. How does raising interest rates actually destroy inflation?
It works by intentionally shrinking the money supply. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to, say, 15 or 20%, borrowing money becomes incredibly expensive.
Right.
Suddenly, regular people stop taking out mortgages to buy houses. Businesses stop taking out loans to build new factories or hire more workers. People are incentivized to keep their money in the bank to earn high interest rather than spend it.
So money just stops flowing out of banks and into the economy.
Exactly. Demand plummets. And when demand plummets, businesses have to stop raising prices or even lower them just to get people to buy anything.
Which causes immense short-term pain for the average person. I mean, when borrowing stops and demand plummets, businesses struggle and unemployment goes way up.
Oh, it was incredibly harsh medicine.
But according to this historical framework, it resulted in long-term stability. The back of the inflation monster was finally broken.
It was. But breaking inflation in the U.S. with Volcker was just one battle.
Yeah.
To really see what happens when the money printing machine truly goes off the rails and how hard it is to fix, you have to look at an economy that was pushed to the absolute brink of collapse.
Right. Let's pivot to Israel in the 1980s. This is a deeply fascinating case study from our materials. We are talking about an economy experiencing absolute hyperinflation.
Yes.
Prices weren't just going up a few percent a year. They were rising at roughly 400% per year.
Try to put yourself in that reality for a second. Imagine you live in Tel Aviv in 1984. You get your paycheck on a Friday morning, and you literally have to sprint to the grocery store on your lunch break to buy food.
That is wild.
Because if you wait until Monday, your money will have lost a noticeable amount of its purchasing power. The prices change daily.
It's just an economy on the brink of total collapse. You can't plan for the future, you can't save for retirement, and the basic everyday functions of a society start to completely unravel.
But the solution the Israeli government eventually implemented in 1985 aligned perfectly with Friedman's thinking.
Yeah.
Their stabilization plan required 3 rigid pillars: fiscal discipline, monetary restraint, and credibility.
And by strictly adhering to those 3 pillars, Israel went from total economic chaos to becoming one of the most stable economies in the world over the following decades.
Completely transformed it.
Okay, I really want to zero in on that last pillar, because the first 2 make intuitive sense based on what we've just talked about. Fiscal discipline simply means the government stops spending money it doesn't have.
Right.
And monetary restraint means the central bank legally stops printing money to cover the government's debts. Those are basically strict math problems.
Yes, exactly.
But that third pillar, credibility, that is pure human psychology. Why is public trust or credibility a mandatory ingredient in fixing hyperinflation?
Because inflation isn't just a math problem. It is deeply intertwined with behavioral psychology. If you, as a consumer, truly believe that the price of a refrigerator is going to be 20% higher next month, what do?
I go buy the refrigerator today, even if I have to put it on a credit card.
Exactly. You rush out and buy everything you can right now. You hoard goods. But when an entire country does that simultaneously, that massive wave of panic buying actually causes the exact shortages and price spikes that everyone was afraid of in the first place.
Oh, wow. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
So the psychology actually dictates the physical reality of the market.
Precisely. So for a government to stop hyperinflation, it's not enough to just quietly change the math behind the scenes. They have to publicly, overwhelmingly convince the public that the money printer is unplugged and they are going to stick to the new rules.
I see.
In Israel's case, they passed strict new laws forbidding the central bank from financing government deficits.
Yeah.
They had to legally bind their own hands to prove to the citizens that they couldn't print money even if they wanted to.
Because if the public doesn't believe them, if the government lacks credibility, the panic buying continues.
Exactly, and inflation keeps running completely regardless of the math.
That is wild. But it worked. Once that formula of discipline, restraint, and credibility was applied, the world enjoyed decades of relative economic stability. But, human memory is painfully short. Which brings us crashing right back into the modern era.
Yeah, we had the historical blueprint, but history has a funny way of rhyming.
Let's bring this right back to you, the listener, in the present day, post-COVID. The analysis lays it out bluntly. During and after the pandemic, governments around the world panicked. The global economy was shutting down.
Right.
And what did they do? They printed massive amounts of money. We saw ubiquitous stimulus checks handed out to citizens. We saw artificially low interest rates kept at rock bottom for years. And we saw absolute liquidity, meaning easy, accessible cash, pumped directly into the global financial system.
And if we look back at Friedman's equation, money supply dictates demand, which dictates prices. The inevitable result was staring us right in the face.
Yeah.
All that excess, easy money was suddenly chasing a limited supply of goods that were severely disrupted by global supply chain issues. And just as the framework predicts, prices exploded.
Yeah.
Inflation came roaring back.
Which leads to the ultimate question posed by the materials. Did we completely forget Milton Friedman? It is deeply ironic that despite having the clear historical blueprint of the 70s and 80s...
We knew what to do.
Right. Despite knowing exactly how Volcker and Reagan and Israel solved this exact issue, the exact same policy choices were made during the pandemic, we fell right back into the mud and slammed our foot on the gas.
Well, the political incentive to hand out money during a crisis is almost irresistible.
True.
Politicians want to be seen as saving the day, and printing money is the easiest way to do that in the short term. However, while the money printing trap is the exact same one we fell into 50 years ago, there is a brand new, completely modern wild card in the mix today that Milton Friedman never had access to.
And this is the twist that absolutely fascinated me. The argument presented in the source is that Milton Friedman, if he were alive today, would probably be the biggest champion of artificial intelligence.
He really would. And importantly, he wouldn't care that AI can write a funny poem or, generate a neat picture.
Right, that's not the point.
No, he would be obsessed with it because of its incredible, unprecedented potential to massively increase human productivity.
Let me throw another analogy at you to make this economic mechanism crystal clear.
No.
Think of the global economy as a giant factory that produces everything we buy.
All right.
When governments printed all that COVID money, it was basically like adding a massive crowd of new, eager buyers with pockets full of cash right at the front door of the factory.
Yeah, lots of demand.
They are all bidding against each other for the exact same amount of stuff coming off the assembly line, which causes chaos and drives the prices up. That's our inflation. But AI is like suddenly going to the back of the factory and upgrading all the machinery overnight.
Right.
So the exact same number of workers can suddenly produce twice as much stuff without needing any extra resources.
And to push that factory analogy even further, AI doesn't just upgrade the machines. It effectively means the analytical and administrative parts of the factory never have to sleep.
Oh, wow.
The efficiency skyrockets. And that economic truth is exactly why productivity is the holy grail of fighting inflation. If you have an excess of money in the system, you really only have two choices to fix the rising prices.
Okay, what are they?
You either have to destroy that money by painfully raising interest rates and causing a recession, like Volcker did in the 80s.
Which nobody wants.
Right. Or you have to dramatically increase the amount of goods and services available to soak up all that extra cash. More output with the exact same amount of money. That is the only painless way to absorb excess money and stabilize prices.
So, to summarize this deep dive, according to the historical framework we've explored today, inflation isn't just bad luck. It isn't just a sudden wave of greedy store owners. It is a monetary phenomenon driven by policy choices.
Exactly.
By printing money, governments dilute purchasing power. And by utilizing technology to increase productivity, we might just be able to build enough goods to soak that money back up.
His ideas are arguably more relevant today than they have ever been, because the real structural question we should be asking our leaders isn't how do we fight inflation once it's here?
Right.
The real question is, do we have the discipline to stop causing it in the first place?
Do we have the discipline to stop causing it? That is heavy. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. Something that builds on this massive AI twist we just discussed.
Let's hear it.
If our modern economy is currently secretly relying on the massive promised productivity boosts of artificial intelligence to quietly absorb all that excess money we printed during COVID, what happens to the global economy if that AI productivity boom eventually plateaus? If the technology doesn't deliver the miraculous, never-ending efficiency gains we're banking on, are we actually curing the disease of inflation right now, or are we just outrunning the monster for a little while longer?
It's a scary thought.
It really is. Next time you are cringing at the price of groceries, ask yourself, did we really fix the engine, or are we